There's a pattern in history that has ended global dominance again and again. In 1557, Spain ruled an empire where the sun never set, importing silver by the ton, until a single year of disrupted flows triggered the first of 4 imperial bankruptcies. In 1956, Britain still controlled bases on every ocean, commanded the world's financial center, and yet one failed canal crisis exposed that its currency, its power, and its independence were already gone. In December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed in just 11 days, despite nuclear weapons, a massive army, and absolute certainty that it would endure forever. Different centuries, different systems, same outcome. And right now, in 2025, the United States is moving through the exact same sequence, stage by stage, almost line for line. And here's what should terrify you. Every empire reaches the moment where confidence disappears faster than power can respond. Before we go through this pattern and these examples, you need to understand what reserve currency collapse actually means. Not in textbooks, in practice. This isn't just about money losing value. It's about power losing credibility. It's about the moment when a system that looks permanent is revealed to be conditional. At first, nothing appears wrong. Trade continues, markets function. People still trust the numbers on the screen. But then, quietly, the foundations begin to shift. Confidence weakens. Costs rise. Promises require more force to maintain. And once that process starts, it doesn't move in straight lines, it moves in bursts. You need to understand something else. Reserve currency status is not a reward for good behavior. It's a burden earned through dominance, enforced through reach, and sustained only as long as the world believes the issuer can absorb infinite costs. Not someday, not eventually, right now. When that belief breaks, the collapse isn't gradual, it's sudden, it's asymmetric. And it's brutal for the population that assumed stability was permanent. This isn't theoretical. That's what happened to Spain when silver stopped solving structural weakness. That's what happened to Britain when the pound could no longer command obedience without American approval. That's what happened to the Soviet Union when economic reality finally overpowered military appearance. Each time, leaders believed they were managing decline. Each time, they were already past the point of control. Let's start with Britain, because this is the blueprint everyone else followed without realizing it. In 1945, the British Empire still looked enormous on a map. It governed roughly 458 million people, about 1/4 of the world's population. It controlled key trade routes, global shipping insurance through Lloyd's of London, and the world's primary financial center in the city of London. The pound sterling was still a reserve currency. British officials believed decline would be slow, manageable, and reversible. But the damage had already been done. By September 1939, Britain entered World War II with gold reserves of roughly $800 million. By 1945, those reserves were effectively gone. The country had accumulated more than $21 billion in war debt, including a $3.75 billion loan from the United States under the 1946 Anglo-American Loan Agreement. That loan came with conditions: convertibility, trade liberalization, and an end to imperial preference. Cause and effect began immediately. In July 1944, Britain signed the Bretton Woods Agreement. The pound was pegged to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. On paper, Britain was still a financial power. In reality, it had subordinated its monetary independence. By 1947, when Britain attempted full pound convertibility, foreign holders rushed to exchange sterling for dollars. In just 6 weeks, Britain lost nearly $1 billion in reserves. Convertibility was suspended in August 1947. The illusion cracked, but the system held. For now. By 1949, pressure forced a formal devaluation. The pound fell from $4.03 to $2.80, a 30% drop overnight. British officials called it a technical adjustment, but here's the critical detail. Devaluation didn't fix the problem, it exposed it. Britain imported food, energy, and raw materials. A weaker pound made all of them more expensive. Living standards stagnated. Rationing, introduced during the war, continued into the early 1950s. Power without prosperity became the norm. At the same time, Britain tried to maintain global military commitments it could no longer afford. In 1945, British forces were stationed in more than 40 countries. Bases stretched from Germany to Malaya, from Egypt to Hong Kong. Defense spending consumed roughly 10% of GDP in the late 1940s. That spending was financed not by surplus, but by borrowing and monetary pressure. The empire was now eating itself to survive. This is where the pattern truly begins. Britain believed geopolitical prestige could compensate for economic weakness. It couldn't. In 1951, Winston Churchill returned as Prime Minister. He promised to restore Britain's global role, but the numbers didn't change. By 1955, Britain's share of global manufacturing output had fallen below 10%. The United States produced more than 40%. Britain was a manager of systems it no longer dominated. Then came 1956. The Suez Crisis wasn't a military failure. It was a financial one. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, alongside France and Israel, planned a military intervention to regain control. The operation began on October 29, 1956. Militarily, it worked. Politically and financially, it was catastrophic. The United States opposed the invasion. More importantly, it refused to support the pound. Speculators began selling sterling immediately. In just 2 weeks, Britain lost more than $280 million in reserves. That may sound small. It wasn't. Britain's total reserves were barely $2.2 billion. At that burn rate, collapse was measured in days. Here's the moment everything changed. On November 6, 1956, the United States made its position clear. No IMF assistance, no emergency dollar support, unless Britain withdrew. Prime Minister Anthony Eden had no choice. Britain ceased military operations, not because its army was defeated, but because its currency was. The effect was immediate and irreversible. The pound survived. British prestige did not. Within a decade, Britain accelerated decolonization. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. By 1967, the pound was devalued again, this time to $2.40. By 1971, the Bretton Woods system collapsed entirely. Britain transitioned from imperial power to secondary state in less than 25 years. This is what reserve currency loss looks like in practice. Not a single crash, a sequence, war debt, currency pegs, reserve drain, devaluation, overextension, and finally, a moment where reality asserts itself faster than leadership can react. Britain didn't fall because it lost a war. It fell because it could no longer afford the illusion of control. That's what this phenomenon looks like. Let's jump forward 400 years, because this pattern didn't begin with Britain. It was already old by the time London learned it the hard way. Let's look at Spain, the first truly global empire of the modern world. In 1550, Spain controlled territories across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa. It commanded the most advanced military of its time. It possessed the largest navy in the world. And most importantly, it controlled the largest flow of precious metals in human history. By 1545, the silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia began producing at an industrial scale. By the 1570s, Spain was importing roughly 200 tons of silver per year. That silver financed armies, fleets, palaces, and wars across the continent. On paper, Spain was unimaginably rich. In practice, it was hollowing itself out. Just like Britain, centuries later, Spain chose power projection over productive capacity. Here's the first stage. Easy money replaces hard production. By 1550, Spain was importing most manufactured goods from the Dutch Republic, Italy, and the German states. Domestic industry collapsed because it couldn't compete with cheaper foreign products paid for with silver. Why invest in production when treasure fleets arrived every year? The cause was clear. The effect was fatal. Spain became dependent on external suppliers for basic economic survival. Then came inflation. Between 1500 and 1600, prices in Spain increased by roughly 400%. Wages did not keep up. The influx of silver expanded the money supply without expanding productive output. Sound familiar? The same mechanism that later crushed Britain and others was already in motion. Wealth on paper, weakness underneath. Now the second stage. Permanent war financed by future promises. Under King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, Spain fought continuous conflicts. The Dutch Revolt beginning in 1568, wars against France in the 1550s and 1590s, the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, the attempted invasion of England in 1588 with the Spanish Armada. Each campaign was justified as necessary. Each was financed by silver that had not yet arrived. Spain declared its first sovereign bankruptcy in 1557, then again in 1575, then again in 1596. 3 defaults in less than 40 years. Each time, creditors accepted restructuring because they believed future silver would solve everything. Just like Britain believed future growth would restore the pound. Just like later empires believed tomorrow would fix today's imbalance. But here's where it gets worse. The silver supply was not stable. Pirate attacks, shipwrecks, war disruptions. When shipments slowed, Spain's entire system seized up. Soldiers went unpaid. Mutinies broke out in the Spanish Netherlands in the 1570s. Antwerp, Europe's financial center, was sacked in 1576, not by enemies, but by Spain's own unpaid troops. Power without liquidity turns inward, every time. By 1600, Spain's share of European manufacturing had collapsed. Its tax base shrank, its debt ballooned. By 1627, another bankruptcy. By 1647, another. 5 major defaults across a century, each one weaker than the last. Just like Britain, Spain tried to defend prestige long after the economic foundation had eroded. And notice the pattern. Reserve status without production, military reach without fiscal control, currency strength enforced by reputation rather than reality. Sound familiar? The same trap that caught Britain was already closing around Spain centuries earlier. The final outcome was slow but absolute. By 1650, Spain was no longer the dominant European power. By 1700, it was strategically irrelevant. The empire lingered on paper, but the system that sustained it was gone. Silver didn't save Spain. It delayed the collapse while making it inevitable. Different century, different currency, identical sequence. Now, let's look at the most recent example, because this is the one that should make you uncomfortable. You probably remember this one, the Soviet Union, a superpower armed with nuclear weapons, spanning 11 time zones, commanding the largest standing army on Earth. In 1970, no serious analyst believed it would disappear within a generation, and yet, by December 1991, it was gone. At its peak in the late 1960s, the Soviet Union controlled nearly 30% of global landmass. It matched the United States in nuclear warheads. It dominated Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact. On the surface, it looked permanent. But just like Spain and Britain, the rot began in the economic foundations long before the flag came down. Here's the first stage: structural stagnation hidden by scale. By 1970, Soviet GDP growth had slowed to under 3%. By 1980, it was closer to 1%. Central planning produced quantity, not efficiency. Factories met quotas, not demand. Productivity lagged badly. A 1983 CIA estimate showed Soviet labor productivity at roughly 55% of US levels. The cause was systemic. The effect was compounding weakness. Stage 2 came through resource dependence. Oil and gas exports became the lifeline. By the late 1970s, energy exports accounted for more than 50% of Soviet hard currency earnings. When oil prices were high, the system survived. When prices fell in the mid-1980s, the illusion shattered. Just like Spain's silver, just like Britain's financial privilege, one revenue stream holding up an entire empire. Then came military overextension. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. What was expected to be a short operation became a 10-year war. By 1989, more than 15,000 Soviet soldiers were dead. The financial cost exceeded 40 billion rubles. More importantly, it exposed limits. The Red Army could occupy territory. It could not convert power into stability. Now watch the acceleration. In 1995, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He understood the system was failing. Perestroika and glasnost were attempts to reform without collapse. But here's the critical detail. Once confidence breaks, reform accelerates decline. By 1989, Eastern European satellites began to fall. Poland, Hungary, East Germany. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. In 2 years, the entire Outer Empire vanished. Then the final collapse. In August 1991, a failed coup exposed total institutional weakness. By December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. 11 days between de facto collapse and legal death. Spain took a century. Britain took decades. The Soviet Union took months. The pattern was accelerating. 3 times, 3 systems, 3 collapses, different ideologies, different centuries, same sequence. And that brings us to the part you cannot ignore. And here's what should terrify you. The United States is following the exact same pattern, stage by stage. Not metaphorically, not loosely, precisely. Stage 1 is structural imbalance hidden by privilege. For decades, the United States consumed more than it produced. In 1971, when President Richard Nixon ended dollar convertibility to gold, the U.S. began running permanent trade deficits. By 2000, the annual trade deficit was roughly $380 billion. By 2024, it exceeded $1 trillion. That gap wasn't paid with exports. It was paid with dollars the world was required to accept. Cause and effect. Reserve status allowed imbalance. Imbalance destroyed discipline. Check. Stage 2 is debt replacing productivity. In 1980, total U.S. federal debt stood at $908 billion. By 2000, it reached $5.7 trillion. By January 2025, it surpassed $36 trillion. That's more than 120% of GDP. Interest alone now exceeds $1 trillion per year, more than the entire U.S. defense budget in 2001. Just like Spain borrowing against future silver, just like Britain borrowing against future growth. Easy financing replaced hard choices. Check. Stage 3 is monetary expansion to cover political limits. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet from under $900 billion to over $7.4 trillion by 2025. During 2020 alone, more than $4 trillion was created in less than 12 months. That money didn't produce factories. It inflated assets. Stocks, housing, bonds. The same mechanism Spain triggered with silver. More money, same output. Prices respond, trust erodes. Check. Stage 4 is global overextension without economic return. The United States maintains roughly 750 military bases across more than 80 countries. Annual defense spending exceeds $880 billion as of 2024. Adjusted for inflation, That's higher than at any point during the Cold War. But unlike 1950, the US no longer produces the industrial base that once supported dominance. In 1953, manufacturing accounted for 28% of GDP. By 2024, it was under 11%. Power is being funded, not generated. Check. Stage 5 is the moment allies quietly adjust. This is where confidence starts to break. In 2015, China launched the cross-border interbank payment system. In 2022, after Russian reserves were frozen, central banks accelerated diversification. Between 2014 and 2024, the dollar's share of global reserves fell from about 66% to roughly 58%. Gold purchases by central banks hit a record 1,037 tons in 2023. That's not symbolic, that's preparation. Check. Stage 6 is loss of enforcement credibility. In August 2021, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. 20 years, over $2 trillion spent. And the government collapsed in 11 days. Images traveled faster than explanations. Just like Suez in 1956, military strength was visible. Financial and political resolve was not. That moment mattered more than speeches. Check. We're not approaching the pattern. We're deep inside it. Look at the parallels. Britain discovered in 1956 that it could not act without U.S. financial approval. The United States is discovering it cannot sanction, borrow and spend without consequences forever. Spain learned silver could not substitute for production. The U.S. learned liquidity cannot substitute for solvency. The Soviet Union learned reform cannot restore trust once it's gone. We're at stage 6 of a 7-stage sequence. Stage 7 is always the same, a trigger event, not the cause, the reveal. For Britain, it was Suez. For Spain, it was silver disruption and mutiny. For the Soviets, it was political fracture after economic exhaustion. Stage 7 for the dollar will be a confidence shock, maybe a failed treasury auction, maybe a geopolitical crisis that forces monetization, maybe a sudden repricing of risk. The pattern doesn't specify the spark, only the outcome. When this happens, your savings don't disappear overnight, they erode. Your purchasing power weakens faster than wages adjust. Imports cost more, financing dries up, social pressure rises, and leadership insists it's temporary every time. Maybe it takes 5 years, maybe 3, maybe less, but the acceleration is unmistakable. Since 2020, every stage has compressed. Debt accumulation, monetary expansion, geopolitical strain, reserve diversification. All faster than history's average.